What they found inside that apartment didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like a lab experiment gone violently wrong. The 911 transcript started like any other panic call. Short breaths, scattered thoughts, a mother unsure of what her son had just told her. It was early afternoon, January 29th, and the caller was somewhere between hysterical and numb. "My son, he said there's someone in the bathtub. Something happened. He told me not to call you, but I did. I don't know what's going on." Emergency dispatch flagged it as a welfare check, nothing unusual, until units arrived. The address was a small apartment building just off Pennant Hills Road in a quiet Sydney suburb where the biggest complaints usually involved noise, after hours, or a forgotten trash bin. The hallway smelled wrong before anyone knocked. It wasn't garbage or mildew, it was chemical, industrial, aggressive, almost surgical, the kind of scent that makes the eyes burn and lungs tighten. Officers made entry with fire department support. What they walked into wasn't chaos. There was no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no pools of blood. Everything appeared contained. The living room was neat, the blinds were drawn, the air conditioner was still running, but the odor intensified near the bathroom, and when responders opened the door, any doubt vanished. The tub was filled with a pale yellow-gray liquid that steamed faintly under the ceiling light. A distorted form lay submerged, swollen, skin partially missing, the fluid slowly breaking down tissue in real time. Officers didn't immediately process what they were seeing. No one said a word for several seconds. Then someone quietly backed out, hand over mouth. Forensics would later determine the liquid was hydrochloric acid, roughly 33% concentration, consistent with commercial-grade products used in industrial cleaning and laboratory applications. Not something sold over the counter. 4 empty 25-liter drums were located in the hallway closet, each bearing the same supplier label. The receipts were gone, but the barcodes were intact. Scene control was initiated immediately, with hazmat containment procedures activated due to fume exposure and risk of chemical injury to personnel. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood spatter, no signs of a struggle. Just one body, dissolved nearly beyond recognition, in an apartment that had clearly been wiped clean. A toothbrush lay untouched on the sink. A bottle of ammonia-based cleaner stood half-used. A pair of gloves were found discarded in the laundry sink, inside out. The rest of the unit, empty, sterile. The responding supervisor initiated a full forensic lockdown. The only person listed on the lease was a 20-year-old male, Miraj Zafar. No known criminal history, no immediate indication of who the victim was. Identification would have to come later, and from dental remains, if any were salvageable. The autopsy team noted early signs of chemical degradation but confirmed the victim had not been placed in the acid immediately after death. Ligature bruising was still identifiable. The neck showed pressure injuries consistent with manual strangulation or a form of asphyxiation. Small traces of blood were found in the tub's drainpipe, preserved by a ring of congealed grease not dissolved by acid. That blood would match a DNA profile on file for a missing 19-year-old woman, but at that point, no one had officially reported her missing. In the following 48 hours, the investigative team compiled the digital trace surrounding the apartment. Surveillance footage from the building's front door showed Zafar entering and exiting 3 times between January 27th and 29, each time carrying what appeared to be sealed plastic containers, large, heavy, held with both arms. He was alone. No other individuals were seen entering during that window, and none were captured leaving. A neighbor later reported hearing raised voices on the night of the 28th, but thought it was just a loud phone call. Another remembered a strong smell late that same night, but didn't investigate further. One tenant admitted seeing Miraj in the laundry room after midnight. "He seemed tired, like out of it. I said hi. He didn't answer." A breakthrough came when forensic teams examined a receipt retrieved from the building's garbage chute, partially soaked but legible. Dated January 28th, it showed a $300 cash purchase at an industrial supplier located 25 miles west. The item? Hydrochloric acid. A routine background check on the supplier revealed they had working surveillance. Zafar was recorded at the counter, alone, wearing a navy hoodie and face mask, paying in cash. No attempt was made to disguise his voice or identity. Inside the apartment, investigators found no women's clothing, no makeup, no toothbrush that didn't belong to the tenant. Only a single long hair, dark, thick, likely female, was stuck in the hinge of the bathroom vanity, swabbed, preserved, sent for comparison. Meanwhile, the landlord confirmed Zafar had moved in 3 months prior, alone, no complaints, rent paid in cash, regularly on time. By the third day, the victim's identity was confirmed through dental comparison and mitochondrial DNA. Arnima Hyatt, 19, medical student, no criminal record, no formal missing person report. Her parents, when contacted, said they hadn't heard from her in several days, but assumed she was busy with exams. They were unaware she had ever lived at that address. They were unaware she had ever married. It wasn't just a homicide. It was a carefully orchestrated disposal of a human body, with intent to erase, not just a person but her presence. The calculated purchase of acid, the deliberate sealing of the bathroom, the absence of any struggle. Every step spoke not of panic, but of planning. Detective Sergeant Lauren Reeve made a quiet note to herself as she closed the bathroom door behind her. "It's too clean," she wrote. "Nothing this brutal should look this quiet." And it wouldn't be the last thing that didn't quite fit. The confirmation of the victim's identity didn't come from a frantic missing persons report or a panicked parent's call. It came from a lab result, cold, clinical, processed through a forensic comparison matrix in less than 90 seconds. The name that returned was Arnima Hyatt, a 19-year-old pre-med student at a metropolitan university. She wasn't flagged in any active search. There were no recent welfare checks, no alerts issued. Technically, until that match was made, no one in the system had even noticed she was gone. The investigators had to begin from zero. No presumption of how or why she ended up in that tub. No domestic history, no known threats. Her social media presence had gone dormant days earlier, but not enough to raise suspicion. Text threads had tapered off. Group chats marked her as read last Thursday. It was digital silence, not digital absence. Tasked with building a profile, Detective Reeve assigned 2 officers to work solely on reconstructing Arnima's last verified movements. The first step was academic records. She had been enrolled for the spring term. Her attendance was marked through the 26th. On the 27th, she had not logged into the university's online portal. Her phone stopped pinging cell towers the same day. Not powered off, just idle. No location updates, no app usage, no calls in or out. Forensic examiners recovered her personal laptop from a shared student housing unit she had briefly occupied the semester before. In its local storage were multiple draft emails unsent. One, dated early January, read, "I've made a mistake. This wasn't what I wanted, but I don't know how to leave it without making things worse." Another, timestamped 10 days later, contained only 2 lines. "He doesn't let me go anywhere alone now. I haven't told my parents." The email drafts aligned with a change in behavior noted by one of her close peers. When contacted, the peer described Arnima as bright, independent, never someone who disappeared without saying something. That same peer shared a text exchange where Arnima had canceled a planned study session saying, "I'm not allowed to meet without asking anymore." The language stood out. Investigators examined social platforms linked to the victim. Her last public post had been 3 weeks prior. Direct messages painted a pattern of isolation, declining events, failing to reply to friends, offering vague excuses. The shift wasn't abrupt, but it was consistent. One message stated, "He said people misunderstand me when I talk too much." Another said, "Don't worry, I'm safe, just under pressure." A subpoena for phone records added another layer. Arnima's number had received repeated calls from a single contact, identified as Miraj Zafar. The volume increased between December and January, often peaking late at night. None of those calls were reported as answered after January 26th. On the 27th, his number sent 3 texts in a 6-minute span. All were short, all were marked delivered, none were read. The psychological pattern was now taking shape. Analysts flagged coercive language in Zafar's outgoing texts. "Don't embarrass me again. You promised not to leave like that. You belong with me." One message, dated 5 days before her death, read, "You don't get to walk away until I say so." The most revealing forensic clue came from her personal university account. Though she had not logged in after January 26th, system logs showed that her academic email was accessed remotely on the 27th at 2:14 a.m. using a device not previously registered, a tablet model traced back to a unit owned by Zafar. The activity lasted less than 2 minutes. A calendar entry she had marked for a counseling session was deleted. At this point, the behavioral forensic team requested a deep dive into control patterns. Victimology reports suggested the relationship, while publicly undisclosed, had shifted into isolation within months of its origin. Several private notes from Arnima's academic journal referred to a secret I regret. And in another entry, it's not a real marriage if you're afraid all the time, right? The absence of physical injury prior to her death did not negate abuse. Forensic psychology protocol in coercive relationships outlined that psychological captivity often leaves no bruises, but it leaves patterns, digital ones, behavioral ones, documented shifts in autonomy. Detectives also noted that while no friends or family formally reported her missing, several had expressed concern informally. One acquaintance, interviewed under sworn statement, recalled asking Arnima if she was okay. Her reply, "I'm okay, I just can't say things out loud right now." What investigators were seeing wasn't a victim who vanished without a trace. It was a victim who had been quietly erased in stages, first from her social circle, then her digital life, then her location. And no one questioned it because everything had happened gradually. Detective Reeve flagged that timeline as critical. "She disappeared in layers," she wrote. "Every one of them looked voluntary, until it wasn't." It was during this phase that the team pulled surveillance logs from bus and train stations. No visual hits of Arnima after January 26th. Her university building's entry system recorded her keycard use for the last time that same day at 3:11 p.m. After that, nothing. The apartment where her body was later found, she was never seen entering it. No camera placed her there. No transit record suggested how she arrived. It was a blank space in a documented world. The gap, though, was not accidental. Forensic sequencing of her absence suggested concealment. The lack of trace was itself a kind of footprint, a designed one. By the close of the week, investigators had built the foundation of motive and method. They had a location, they had a timeline, and they had a victim who never should have gone unnoticed. But the hardest question remained: how did no one act sooner? In major casework, especially when a body is discovered in conditions designed to destroy evidence, the next viable witness is usually silent: a hard drive, a server log, a cached browser string. And in this investigation, the digital trail would speak louder than any testimony. The forensic extraction of the suspect's electronic devices began immediately after the search warrant was executed. A laptop, a smartphone, and a tablet were seized from the apartment. All were password protected but not encrypted beyond standard OS-level protocols. Mobile forensics technicians performed a full logical image within 18 hours of seizure. Despite some attempt at recent file deletion, data recovery software uncovered substantial metadata going back months. The search history told a story no witness ever could. On January 25th, 2 days before the estimated time of death, there were searches for how long does it take for hydrochloric acid to break down a body and how to dispose of human remains undetected. These queries were not hidden. They were made using standard Google access on the Chrome browser, not through incognito mode or any private proxy. The timestamps placed them between 1:10 and 2 a.m. These were not idle clicks. Each term was followed by multiple link opens, page views, and revisits to related topics. Investigators built a forensic timeline from browser data. It started weeks prior with generalized inquiries into acid reactions, chemical handling, and DIY disposal techniques. There was a noticeable escalation in both frequency and specificity. By mid-January, searches had shifted to jurisdictional sentencing laws. Penalty for murder in Sydney. How long is life sentence NSW? And what happens if you plead guilty to homicide? That shift in query type, from hypothetical to legal consequence, suggested intent was crystallizing. The device logs showed no evidence of panic. There was no flurry of deletions after the crime, no browser clearing activities. Instead, there were deliberate actions. A few files, mostly PDF invoices and screenshots, had been removed, but not overwritten securely. Disk analysis recovered one deleted note file titled planchecklist.rtf, which included lines such as acid location confirmed, container storage, hall closet, and phone no outgoing after 27th. At the same time, the mobile device displayed a different pattern. Unlike the laptop, the phone reflected erratic activity around the time of the crime. Between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. on January 28th, location services toggled on and off 3 times. GPS data showed brief movement to the building's back lot and then return. No external calls were made, but 6 internet searches were performed in that span. One stood out: how to delay decomposition after death. While content can be staged, timelines can't. Device metadata showed the bathtub light was activated via smart switch at 2:41 a.m. That system, part of a basic IoT automation setup, stored log entries that were retrievable by police. It remained on until 5:52 a.m. In those 3 hours, the water temperature had been set to max, then stopped. Forensics later confirmed the water heater capacity matched the estimated liquid temperature observed at scene. This temperature level would accelerate tissue breakdown once acid was introduced. The suspect's tablet, rarely used in the weeks prior, showed one unusual activity spike. On January 27th, it accessed the victim's university portal. IP logs showed the login originated from the apartment's network. 2 calendar entries were deleted and 1 email folder marked counseling was cleared. The action was brief, under 3 minutes, but deliberate. Technicians also recovered fragments of a conversation between the suspect and an unidentified contact. One message, recovered from deleted cache, read, "She's not going to walk out, it's handled." No response followed. No identity tied to the recipient. The number, when traced, was a prepaid SIM no longer in use. The deletion didn't suggest panic. It indicated a controlled effort to limit visibility. But it was the voice note that raised the most red flags. Buried in the temporary audio cache of the phone's messaging app was an unsent recording, 16 seconds long. No words were spoken, just ambient sound, running water, then a single knock on a hard surface. Experts flagged the noise as possibly being the sound of a lid or container being moved. There was no metadata indicating the note was ever shared, and still, no trace of the victim's phone. Investigators now had a chain of intent, planning, and cleanup behavior, but no evidence of direct messaging between the suspect and Arnima in the 48 hours before her death. That gap could not be explained through device failure or loss. It was more likely the messages had been removed or sent through platforms with auto-delete settings. Yet even that couldn't fully conceal the behavioral pattern. The digital blueprint was increasingly precise. There was no element of spontaneity. There was documentation of chemical acquisition, process handling, and time-controlled actions, all preceding the confirmed time of death. Everything from smart light activation to file deletion formed a silent confession in binary code. Detective Reeve documented her summary. If this had been rage, the data would have been erratic. This was calculated, time-stamped, and clean. And it wasn't over. The next phase would uncover the psychological layers beneath the mechanical ones. Because even when data speaks, it doesn't explain why. By the time the autopsy was scheduled, most of the digital evidence had already begun forming a timeline. But timelines don't establish cause of death. They don't define the moment a person's life is taken, only the context that surrounds it. That's where pathology takes over. The postmortem on Arnima Hyatt began 72 hours after the body was recovered from the apartment. The remains were transported in a sealed chemical containment bag due to ongoing decomposition and acid exposure. The attending medical examiner, Dr. Liza Parcell, was a senior forensic pathologist with experience in post-chemical decomposition and high-profile homicide cases. She had conducted more than 1,100 autopsies over her career, but noted in her report, "This case presented a unique combination of chemical assault and soft tissue preservation. Partial dissolution was evident, but critical evidence remained intact. Despite the hydrochloric acid immersion, the thoracic cavity was largely unbreached. The internal organs had begun liquefying, but the cervical spine, hyoid bone, and several muscular structures were preserved enough to allow for focused examination. Bruising patterns on the upper throat area were examined under high-resolution post-processing. Subdermal hemorrhaging was found in the strap muscles of the neck, consistent with manual strangulation. The hyoid was fractured cleanly on the left posterior horn, a break pathologically linked to external pressure applied with sustained force. Toxicology was run on residual tissue and liver samples that hadn't been fully compromised by acid. No presence of opioids, benzodiazepines, or anesthetic compounds were detected. This finding eliminated theories of chemical sedation or accidental overdose. The examiner also confirmed there were no bone fractures to limbs or skull, no sharp force trauma, and no defensive injuries on the forearms, suggesting the victim may have been caught off guard or overpowered without struggle. The lungs showed diffuse petechiae, and there was mild aspiration of fluid, likely from the initial moments of acid immersion post-mortem. The ME noted, the individual was likely deceased prior to submersion. Evidence supports cause of death by mechanical asphyxiation. Death was not instantaneous. Estimated duration of strangulation, 45 to 75 seconds. Time of death estimation was aided by entomological markers and early decomposition patterns. Body temperature at recovery was not usable due to the chemical environment. However, degradation patterns in soft tissue were matched against acid exposure simulation models and time-lapse decay under similar environmental conditions. The conclusion: death occurred between 1:30 and 3 a.m. on January 28th, within a window that directly aligned with the digital footprint from the suspect's devices and IoT system logs recovered in Chapter 3. The bathtub material, standard porcelain over steel, showed signs of etching. Chemical splatter had affected surrounding caulking and drain sealants, but not at a concentration high enough to fully eliminate trace evidence. Microfiber residue embedded in the edge of the tub was lifted and sent for trace analysis. A match returned. Cotton polyester blend blue, consistent with the cleaning gloves found in the laundry sink. Inside the drain trap, investigators recovered small fragments of what appeared to be human tissue, non-osteological, gelatinous in texture. DNA analysis confirmed it matched the victim. A swab trace of saliva was also detected beneath the nail bed of the victim's left ring finger, though it was unclear if it had any evidentiary value due to contamination. The final autopsy report was clear. Cause of death: manual strangulation with evidence of sustained neck compression. Manner of death: homicide. Additional notes: post-mortem submersion in high-concentration hydrochloric acid as a method of body destruction. Evidence suggests premeditated concealment and understanding of decomposition interference. The scientific findings confirmed what the investigators had already begun to piece together, but in sharper detail. It wasn't just a matter of what happened. It was how efficiently the process had been planned. The pathology didn't just show death. It showed method, timing, and effort. Dr. Parcell included a clinical summary that would later be entered into court evidence. It read, "The attempt to dissolve the body did not succeed entirely, but it succeeded in one regard. It delayed our ability to determine how she died, and that was likely the intention." Detective Reeve annotated her own margin in the autopsy file. If you're planning for what the autopsy might reveal, you already know you're committing murder. What this phase revealed wasn't just the mechanism of death. It was confirmation that concealment had been a central objective from the start. Acid wasn't used out of desperation. It was selected for function. There was no ambiguity remaining about whether this was a spontaneous act. The body told the story the room tried to hide. By the time the autopsy report confirmed the cause of death as manual strangulation, detectives were no longer asking what happened to Arnima Hyatt. That question had been answered through data, bone fractures, and chemical residue. The next question was operational. Where was the man whose apartment had become a chemical disposal site? Miraj Zafar hadn't been seen since the morning of January 29th, hours before first responders entered his unit. His phone had gone offline that same morning, pinging last from a tower outside Sydney's western perimeter. No known vehicle was registered to his name, and public transportation logs offered no hits after his departure. The tracking gap wasn't accidental. It was deliberate and informed. Detectives reviewed CCTV footage from the building's exterior, where Zafar had been captured leaving with a duffel bag. He walked calmly, checked his surroundings once, and exited the frame. This wasn't an escape at gunpoint or a panicked flight. It was silent movement, the kind that suggests someone had already planned what to do after the scene was sealed. Law enforcement initiated a statewide alert. A bolo, "Be on the lookout," was circulated with his photo and details to every transport hub and checkpoint. But in the hours following the discovery, Zafar's name hadn't reached the public. Investigators chose containment over exposure, fearing that premature media release might trigger unpredictable behavior if he was still monitoring news. The strategy changed when a local journalist received a tip. A media outlet ran the story just 36 hours after the body's discovery. It was vague, mentioning chemical materials, an unidentified woman, and a man of interest. By then, the family had been notified and Arnima's name became public. Once it did, the pressure accelerated. Community groups called for transparency. University officials confirmed her enrollment and released a brief statement expressing condolences. But what drew the most reaction wasn't official. It was the silence around the relationship. Students who knew Arnima expressed disbelief. None were aware she was married. Some didn't even know she had moved out of her prior residence. Investigators began mapping Zafar's known associations. Former classmates provided minimal leads. No workplace, no gym records, no recent banking activity. His last known financial transaction was the cash purchase of hydrochloric acid, paid with bills withdrawn in small increments over 2 weeks. Detectives flagged that pattern. It suggested anticipation. He hadn't just withdrawn cash for supplies. He'd stopped leaving a digital trail before the crime occurred. On February 2nd, 4 days after the initial welfare call, a member of the public recognized Zafar's image on social media and contacted police. He had been spotted near a service station southwest of Sydney. Surveillance was recovered. The match was confirmed. He was alone, carrying a plastic bag and wearing the same shoes from the building footage. He didn't purchase gas. He used the restroom, then walked off behind the complex, exiting frame into open scrubland. Aerial support was dispatched, and a search perimeter was established. It took 8 more hours to locate him. He was walking alongside a fence line in a semi-rural zone. No resistance was offered when officers approached. He carried no weapons. He spoke only once, asking for water. At the station, he was placed under observation. Legal counsel was appointed, and he did not consent to questioning. No statement was given, no explanation, no acknowledgement. But in his possession was a prepaid SIM, a small notebook, and 3 receipts. One was for food, one for a burner phone. The third, dated January 28th, was from a hardware store, showing purchases of gloves, tape, and plastic sheeting. Those items were never found at the apartment. Detectives noted one thing about Zafar's capture. There was no evidence of suicide planning, no attempt to flee the country, no call made to family, friends, or associates. What he was doing for those 4 days remained unexplained. But what was clear from every receipt and trace was that he hadn't acted out of impulse. He had planned his silence, just like he had planned the rest. And now, with him in custody, the process would shift again, from investigation to prosecution. By the time Miraj Zafar was charged with murder, the forensic evidence against him was already stacked across 5 case files. But the trial wouldn't be won by lab reports alone. Prosecutors needed to translate science into narrative, one that could hold in court and carry the weight of a motive never formally confessed. The first formal hearing was procedural. Zafar appeared via video link. He did not apply for bail. He entered no plea. His counsel requested adjournment to review disclosure materials. The courtroom was quiet. The only audible shift came when the prosecution named the charge, intentional homicide with post-mortem interference. That phrasing had been strategically chosen. It combined the cause of death with the method of concealment, not just murder. A body submerged in hydrochloric acid indicated premeditation, not passion. Prosecutors focused on sequencing, reconstructing the crime through forensic markers. Each detail had to serve a function, not just exist for shock. First, intent, search history, supply acquisition, deleted plans, all time-stamped before Arnima's death. Then, means, digital logs of the smart light system, purchase receipts, chemical container testing, and finally, post-act behavior, flight, silence, possession of unregistered devices. But motive remained abstract. There was no confession, no journal, no direct threat captured in text. To address that, the prosecution relied on behavioral patterning. 2 friends of Arnima were brought in to provide sworn statements. One recalled that Arnima said she was afraid of upsetting him, that she was not free to leave things. The second described a phone call where Arnima abruptly hung up mid-sentence, then texted, "I'm not allowed to say that out loud." The defense challenged the admissibility of these statements. Without formal reports of abuse, the defense argued, hearsay could not be construed as evidence of coercion. But the court allowed both statements as part of a broader pattern. Psychological isolation, prosecutors argued, leaves no single scar, but a sequence of fractures. To tighten the timeline, expert testimony was called. A forensic data analyst walked the jury through device logs, every search term, every timestamp. How the tablet used to erase Arnima's counseling calendar had been idle for weeks, until the very night before her disappearance. A toxicologist followed, confirming the acid type matched the container labels. No ambiguity, no cross-contamination, just industrial-grade hydrochloric acid purchased legally, used criminally. The pathology report was read aloud in full. The courtroom remained silent as Dr. Parcell confirmed that Arnima died from sustained neck compression, that she was likely unconscious before death, that her body showed no signs of defensive wounds, and that the acid immersion began after death, not before. Every fact was grounded in measurable data, not speculation, not inference. Still, jurors are not machines. Prosecutors didn't dramatize, but they didn't sanitize either. They framed Arnima not as a name on paper, but as a university student, one who never finished the semester, never returned a single call, never made it to her counseling session. The prosecution strategy was built on restraint, no theatrics, just the weight of absence. The defense presented no alternative suspect, no theory of third-party involvement. They argued only that the prosecution had no direct evidence of the act itself, no eyewitness, no physical video, no recorded confession. But circumstantial evidence, when layered, becomes a wall. And this wall had been built with digital logs, smart home data, search history, purchase records, forensic pathology, and a consistent behavioral pattern that no one else fit. During closing arguments, prosecutors didn't speculate about motive. They relied on planning and result, intent, action, concealment. The classic three-part structure of homicide cases. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The Supreme Court of New South Wales convened on December 15, 2024. Miraj Zafar stood for sentencing, flanked by legal counsel, silent as ever. He had entered a guilty plea to the charge of murder with intent and post-mortem interference, a decision reached after forensic evidence left little room for viable defense. There was no trial by jury, just facts on paper, expert testimony, and the quiet confirmation that no one else could have committed the act. The court sentenced Zafar to 21 years and 6 months in prison, with a non-parole period of 16 years. He would not be eligible for early release until 2038, by which time he would be 37 years old. The judge described the act as an egregious breach of trust, compounded by calculated concealment. No visible emotion crossed Zafar's face. No statement of remorse was made. No explanation was offered. In the absence of answers, the sentence stood as society's only resolution. Arnima Hayat's family had traveled from Bangladesh to attend the hearing. In court, they sat quietly through the proceedings. After sentencing, a cousin read a prepared statement outside the building. He didn't speak of revenge. He spoke of what Arnima could have become, a doctor, a daughter, a contributor to the world. He spoke of their grief, yes, but also of the system's failure to see her when she was quietly being erased. That failure would become the second story of this case. In the weeks following the sentencing, advocacy groups began pushing for reform, not in response to courtroom procedure, which had functioned as designed, but to the invisible gap that led up to the murder. Arnima had never reported domestic abuse. She had never reached out to police, campus resources, or community groups, but that didn't mean she hadn't been in danger. According to data reviewed by NSW domestic violence specialists, culturally isolated relationships, especially undocumented or religious-only marriages, often left victims unprotected by formal structures. Without a public legal marriage, there were no spousal rights, no red flags in social service systems, and no standard welfare checks triggered by withdrawal from school or counseling. In response, the University of New South Wales launched an internal review. Faculty members confirmed that Arnima had quietly stopped attending classes. No one flagged her absence. No one called. One advisor described her as brilliant but reserved. In truth, no protocols required them to follow up. She had simply disappeared from the roster. Community groups demanded that universities and health services revisit protocols for vulnerable students, particularly international women navigating unfamiliar legal and social landscapes. A memorial service held by the student body drew hundreds. It wasn't just a space to mourn. It was an acknowledgement, too late, that silence could be a signal. As for the investigation, every forensic angle had been documented and closed, but some questions remained open. Not because of gaps in evidence, but because Zafar had refused to speak. There was no known financial motive, no mental health defense, no sudden trigger. The prosecution never speculated beyond what could be proven, but investigators later admitted that control, not rage, seemed to be the operating force. Detective Reeve, the lead investigator, summarized it bluntly in her final report. This wasn't an explosion, it was containment. She tried to leave something he didn't want to lose. No other suspects were ever considered, no accomplice, no third-party interference. But some items Zafar purchased prior to the murder, plastic sheeting, gloves, tape, were never recovered. Authorities suspect some tools used in the preparation and cleanup were destroyed or dumped in locations too remote to track. The acid was chosen deliberately. So was the timeline. So was the silence. The case of Arnima Hayat ended not in mystery but in warning. The data didn't lie. The forensics held. The timeline was airtight, but the broader narrative, how a 19-year-old woman could vanish from her social, academic, and medical circles without alarm, remained unresolved in the system's deeper machinery. In its final statement, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions issued a recommendation for wider public education campaigns on coercive control, especially in communities where formal reporting may be culturally discouraged or legally ambiguous. Legislation on coercive control would later be introduced to the New South Wales Parliament, citing the Hyatt case in its footnotes. But legislation like justice moves slower than violence. In true crime investigations, the focus is often on the act, but here the lead-up carried equal weight. The methodical nature of the crime revealed intent, but the world around Arnima revealed the absence of intervention. She was not failed in death, she was failed in silence. And that silence had many enablers, outdated protocols, legal blind spots, and a culture slow to recognize that control doesn't always leave bruises. As the court sealed the case, one line from Detective Reeves' log remained in archive. She was removed from visibility before she was removed from life. I've seen how silence can be deadlier than any weapon, how control, when cloaked in love, can erase someone without a single bruise. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Pay attention to the quiet exits, the subtle disappearances, the isolation no one notices until it's too late. This wasn't just a crime, it was a warning about what we miss when we don't ask hard questions. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What did this story make you think about? Have you ever witnessed someone slowly disappear from their own life? Let's talk in the comments. And if this story moved you or made you pause, let me know where you're watching from, or even why it didn't work for you. If this video reached you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case we bring to light.